An Arab millionaire dressed as a poor man to test his new employee. She had no idea who that man really was, who showed up at the door asking for help. What that woman decided to do in that moment changed both their lives forever. Where are you watching from? Hit that like and subscribe because this story will impact you until the very end. The sun was barely rising over the Hamptons shoreline when Karim Nasir, owner of one of the Middle East's most important hotel empires, looked at himself in the Italian marble bathroom mirror of his estate. The reflection showed an impeccable man, perfectly trimmed silver hair, meticulously groomed beard, a white linen suit that cost more than the monthly salary of many of his employees. However, his green eyes, an inheritance from his Lebanese maternal grandmother, revealed an emptiness that no bank account had managed to fill in 53 years of existence. Wealth builds walls so high that one can't even see the horizon, he murmured to himself as he opened a secret cabinet behind a panel in his closet. Inside hung worn, dirty, tattered clothes, the perfect disguise for his purpose. Half an hour later, the hotel magnate had disappeared. In his place emerged an unrecognizable man, unkempt beard, stained clothes, the smell of days without bathing. He left through a side door of the Nasser estate, his property in East Hampton, and took a long detour to approach again, this time through the service entrance. His heart beat strongly beneath that dirty shirt. It wasn't the first time he had performed this transformation. 15 people had already undergone the beggar boss test. 15 had failed. The path of century-old oaks leading to the kitchen was impregnated with the scent of lavender and rosemary. Purple bougainvillea climbed the white walls of the mansion, creating a hypnotic contrast against the Atlantic sky. Karim paused for a moment, contemplating his personal empire as if for the first time. From this perspective, his home seemed like an impenetrable fortress, a refuge that he himself had transformed into an elegant golden prison. Perhaps it's not others who have failed me, he thought with a flash of lucidity that he quickly dismissed, but I who never gave them a real opportunity. The woman had arrived just 7 days ago, Winifred Caldwell, 58 years old, from a small town lost in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. Her hiring file listed 3 grandchildren in her care and a lifetime dedicated to domestic service. The Human Resources Department had recommended her for her experience, but Karim knew that meant nothing. Trust wasn't earned through resumes. When he finally knocked on the back door, the smell of cinnamon and cardamom, spices he insisted be used according to the traditions of his native land, flooded his senses, momentarily transporting him to his childhood in Beirut. It took several seconds for him to slip back into his beggar role. "Water, please," he murmured in a hoarse voice, lowering his gaze as he had seen so many needy people do on the streets of Dubai, where he began washing dishes at 17. What happened next marked the beginning of a journey that would forever change the course of 2 existences that should never have crossed paths. Winifred Caldwell had been working at the Nasser estate for exactly 1 week, but she had already established a routine that she executed with military precision. She woke up at 5 in the morning in the small apartment she had rented in a modest neighborhood of Southampton, prepared breakfast to leave it ready for her grandchildren when they woke up, and left half an hour earlier than necessary to arrive punctually at her new job. Working at the Lebanese millionaire's mansion represented an opportunity she never thought possible at 58. The salary tripled what she earned cleaning houses in West Virginia, and with that money, she could finally provide stability for Thaddeus, Montgomery, and little Elliot, the 3 children of her daughter Hope, who had become disabled after an accident at the textile factory where she worked. That January morning, while preparing breakfast in the mansion's immense kitchen, Winifred hummed an old folk song her mother had taught her decades ago. Her hands, calloused from years of hard work, moved skillfully between pots and pans. She had added cardamom and cinnamon to the coffee, exactly as indicated in the detailed instructions the butler had given her on the first day, although she had not yet personally met Mr. Nasser. "They say the boss is almost never home," Prudence had explained, the only other household employee who worked on the property. "He comes 2 or 3 times a year, locks himself in his office and then disappears. He's a ghost with a checkbook, but he pays punctually and is generous with bonuses if you follow his demands to the letter." The sound of knuckles knocking on the back door interrupted her thoughts. Winifred startled. She wasn't expecting visitors through that entrance, reserved exclusively for supplier deliveries, and these never occurred so early. Upon opening the door, she found herself facing a man of pitiful appearance. Unkempt beard, dirty clothes, reddened eyes that avoided hers. A homeless man, she thought immediately, like those who occasionally appeared around the mansions of the Hamptons coastline. "Water, please," the man murmured in a voice that seemed rusted from disuse. Winifred observed the stranger for a moment that seemed to freeze time. In her mind flashed images of her father, who, after losing everything in the Great Flood of 1979, had returned home transformed into little more than a beggar, having lost everything except his dignity. She remembered how the neighbors, as poor as they were, had offered him what little they had without asking questions. "Of course, sir, come in," she responded naturally, as if receiving beggars at the back door of a mansion was the most normal thing in the world. "It's hellishly hot today. I'll serve you fresh water and something to eat. Nobody should walk around on an empty stomach under this sun." Karim Nasir, under his beggar disguise, was momentarily disconcerted. None of the 15 previous people had invited him in. Most had barely handed him a glass of water reluctantly and quickly closed the door, fearing someone would discover them attending to a beggar on someone else's property. "I don't want to cause problems, ma'am," he murmured, performing his role perfectly. "Problems? Not at all," she exclaimed with a smile that illuminated the wrinkles around her eyes. "What would be a problem is if my late mother saw me denying water to someone who's thirsty. That would bring me problems, but from the other world." Winifred's frank laughter echoed in the kitchen as she indicated a chair by the auxiliary table where employees usually ate. Karim sat cautiously, studying every movement of that woman who acted with a disconcerting naturalness. "My father always said that the roads are full of angels in disguise," continued Winifred as she served a glass of cold water and began to heat up leftovers from the previous night's dinner, "and that treating a stranger well is never wasting kindness." Karim drank the water slowly, observing over the rim of the glass how she moved through the kitchen with a surprising familiarity for someone who had barely completed a week working there. There was something in her way of occupying the space, of treating him with respect but without civility, that defied all his preconceptions about the people he hired. "Are you hungry, sir?" she asked, placing before him a plate of lamb stew with Lebanese spices, rice with almonds, and a generous portion of freshly baked bread. It was left over from last night, a shame to throw it away when there are those who need it. The aroma of the stew hit his senses like a punch. It was his favorite dish, prepared exactly as his mother made it in Beirut. A recipe he had detailed meticulously in the instruction manual for the Nasir estate kitchen, but which rarely had anyone executed with such precision. "What's your name?" asked Winifred, sitting across from him with a steaming cup of coffee between her calloused hands. "Karim," he responded automatically before he could censor himself. "I'm Winifred Caldwell from Harper's Ferry, a town that even God forgets in West Virginia. I've been here a week, working for an important gentleman I haven't even met yet." She paused and added with a conspiratorial look, "They say he's a lonely man, with more money than friends. A pity, because loneliness doesn't distinguish between rich and poor, does it?" Karim felt a knot in his throat that prevented him from responding. In his 53 years of life, no one had defined his existence with such precision and in so few words. During the following 2 weeks, Karim continued his charade, presenting himself occasionally as the beggar at the back door of his own mansion. Each time, Winifred received him with the same genuine warmth, sharing not just food, but also fragments of her life, memories of West Virginia, anecdotes about her grandchildren and folk wisdom that resonated with a profound truth that he had forgotten long ago. What began as a test to evaluate an employee's honesty gradually transformed into a window to a world that Karim had left behind, that of authentic human relationships, devoid of interest or artifice. On a particularly hot morning, while observing from his office, he noticed something unusual. Winifred arrived 15 minutes earlier than usual, but instead of immediately entering the house, she stopped in the garden in front of a sick oak tree that the gardeners had recommended removing. He saw her kneel beside the tree, remove the dried earth, and carefully pour the contents of a bottle she brought in her purse. Intrigued, Karim activated the security camera system to hear what was happening. "My grandfather said that plants are like people," Winifred murmured, as she worked the earth around the dying oak. "Sometimes they just need someone to believe in them, when everyone else has given up on them." She completely poured the contents of the bottle, A homemade mixture, Karim supposed, and continued, "I'm not going to let them uproot you, little one. You've given shade and beauty for decades. You deserve a second chance." Something stirred inside Karim, something that had been dormant since he was a boy in Beirut, when his mother taught him the value of each living being as they tended together to the small garden on the rooftop of their modest home. That same afternoon, he presented himself again as the beggar, but this time, something had changed in his interior. He was no longer just acting. A part of him genuinely yearned for that human connection that Winifred offered without reservations. "Karim, what a joy to see you," she exclaimed upon opening the door. "I was making cornbread and thought of you. Sit down, please." While they ate together, Winifred told him about her daughter Hope, who had become partially paralyzed after an accident at the textile factory where she worked. She told him about little Elliot, only 6 years old, who suffered from a congenital heart condition that required constant medical attention. "The hardest thing isn't the hard work," she confessed with bright eyes, but without shedding a single tear. "The hard thing is keeping hope when it seems the world only gives you blows. But then I look at my grandchildren, see their smiles, and remember that I don't have the right to give up." Karim listened to her with an intensity that surprised himself. He, who had spent decades building an empire, had never had anyone to fight for except for his own pride and ambition. "And you, Karim?" she asked suddenly. "Do you have family?" The question caught him off guard. For a moment he considered inventing a story consistent with his beggar character, but something in Winifred's sincere eyes prevented him from lying. "No," he responded with an honesty that made him feel strangely vulnerable. "I was too busy building walls to found a home." Winifred looked at him for a long time, as if she could see beyond his disguise, beyond even what he himself was capable of recognizing. "It's never too late to tear down those walls," she finally said, placing a calloused hand over his. "Life is generous with those who dare to start anew." That night, Karim couldn't sleep. For the first time in years, he felt that the walls of his luxurious mansion were suffocating him. Winifred's words resonated in his mind like an echo impossible to silence. "What if my whole life has been a mirage?" he asked himself, as he observed from his window the sick oak tree that she had decided to save. In late January, the Hamptons burned under a relentless sun. Tourists sought refuge on the beaches, and locals barely ventured out during the hottest hours of the day. At the Nasir estate, climate control systems maintained a perfect temperature in each room, but the heat seemed to have settled inside Karim, a fever that had nothing to do with the outside climate. Each day he found himself more anxious for his encounters with Winifred in his role as a beggar. Each day it became more difficult to maintain the charade, to restrain himself from revealing who he really was, from immediately offering all the support that she and her family needed. "You're losing objectivity," he reprimanded himself as he put on the fake beard in front of the mirror. "Remember Samira, Karima, all those who took advantage of your trust." But something had changed. He was no longer sure he wanted to find flaws in Winifred. On the contrary, each new virtue he discovered in her made him feel smaller, more unworthy of her unconditional kindness. That day, he decided to raise the stakes. He accidentally left an envelope with $5,000 in cash in plain sight on the garden table. He discreetly installed an additional camera and waited. Winifred found the envelope while cleaning the terrace. The recording clearly showed her reaction. First surprise, then concern. He saw her open the envelope, count the money with trembling hands, and finally store everything in a drawer of the desk in the office, leaving a detailed note about the find. "Mr. Nasir, I found this envelope with $5,000 on the terrace. I've kept it in the first drawer of your desk for greater security. Winifred Caldwell." Karim watched the scene repeatedly from the monitor in his room. He had subjected many employees to the same test before. All had failed in different ways, some taking the money directly, others finding less than the original amount. Winifred was the first to document exactly the value and keep it in a safe place. That afternoon, while playing the beggar, he decided to test the waters. "You seem worried today, Winifred," he commented as she served him a cup of mint tea. She sighed deeply before responding. "You know, Karim, today I found a lot of money on the terrace, more money than I earn in 2 months. "And that worries you?" he asked, carefully studying her expression. "I worry that Mr. Nasser will think I meddled with something I shouldn't have. The rich tend to be distrustful. She paused before continuing. But something else worries me too. With that money, I could pay for the surgery my grandson Elliot needs. With that money, he could... Her voice broke momentarily, but she composed herself with dignity. But it's not mine, is it? And what doesn't belong to us only brings misfortune. My mother taught me that, and I taught it to my children. Honor is the only thing that no one can take from you because it's the only thing you decide to give or keep. Karim felt something strange in his throat, a knot that grew, preventing him from speaking. All his life, he had judged people by their reaction to temptation, convinced that everyone had a price. Now faced with this woman who refused an easy solution to her most urgent problems out of pure principle, his certainties were shaken. Perhaps your employer will want to reward you for your honesty, he finally suggested, probing the ground. Winifred laughed with that crystalline sound that had begun to obsess Karim. The rich don't usually reward what they consider obligatory, Karim. I don't expect medals for doing what's right. Then she added with a melancholic smile, besides, Mr. Nasser isn't even here. They say he almost never comes to the mansion. He's like a ghost that pays salaries. The phrase hit him with the force of a revelation. That was exactly what he had become, a ghost that paid salaries. A man who had everything except the one thing that really mattered, genuine human connections. That night, Karim made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. The morning was clear and bright when Karim Nasser, dressed in one of his usual Italian linen suits. He looked at himself for a long time in the mirror, recognizing for the first time in years how much he disliked himself. The impeccable suit, the gold Rolex, the exclusive perfume. None of it truly reflected who he was. Or worse still, perhaps they reflected him perfectly. An empty shell obsessed with appearances. He went down to the kitchen at 8 o'clock, the time he knew Winifred would be preparing breakfast. Seeing him enter, she almost dropped the tray she was carrying in her hands. It was the first time she had seen Mr. Nasser in person, or so she believed. "Good morning, Winifred," he greeted her with a firm but kind voice. "Mr. Nasser," she stammered, obviously nervous. "I didn't know you were at the estate. I'll prepare your breakfast immediately." "There's no need to hurry," he replied, sitting at the kitchen table, something he had never done before. "I'd like coffee with cardamom and cinnamon. You prepare it exactly as my mother did in Beirut." Winifred looked at him in confusion. "Thank you, sir. I just follow the instructions in the manual they gave me." "Instructions can be followed mechanically or with the heart," he replied. "You clearly do the latter." While Winifred prepared the coffee, visibly tense by the unexpected presence of her employer, Karim observed each of her movements with a new perspective. The same gestures he had studied for weeks as beggar Karim he now saw from his true identity. "Winifred, do you remember the envelope with money you found yesterday on the terrace?" She immediately tensed. "Yes, sir. I left it in your desk with a note. I hope that was correct. I didn't want to—" "It was exactly the right thing," he gently interrupted her, "and I want to thank you for your honesty." "You don't need to thank me, sir," she replied with simplicity. Anyone would have done the same. Karim couldn't help but smile with certain bitterness. If she knew how many people had failed precisely that test. "I'd like to tell you a story, if you'll allow me," he said, as he accepted the cup of coffee she offered him. "It's about a boy from Beirut who lost his parents during the Lebanese Civil War and had to emigrate alone to Dubai at 17. During the next hour, Karim related his story, how he began washing dishes in a small hotel, how he saved every dirham, how he secured his first loan to buy a dilapidated hostel, and how step by step he built a hotel empire that stretched from Morocco to Qatar. "But as my wealth grew, my trust in humanity diminished," he confessed. Every person who approached seemed to have ulterior motives. Every smile hid a request. Every compliment preceded a betrayal. Winifred listened to him attentively, standing by the counter, momentarily forgetting her position as an employee given the intimacy of that unexpected confession. "That's why I began to test people," he continued. "To disguise my identity to see who they really were when they believed there was nothing to gain." Winifred's eyes opened wide with surprise as understanding began to dawn on her face. "You are," she murmured, bringing a hand to her mouth. "Karim, the beggar who has been coming to your door," he confirmed, holding her gaze. "And you, Winifred, are the first person in 15 years who has passed all my tests without even knowing you were being examined." A dense silence filled the kitchen. Winifred leaned against the counter, visibly affected by the revelation. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible. "Why play like this with people?" The question, simple and direct, hit Karim like a slap. He had never really questioned the ethics of his tests, convinced they were justified by his past experiences. "Because I was afraid," he finally admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. Afraid of trusting again and being disappointed. Afraid that all kindness had a price. Winifred looked at him for a long time with an indecipherable expression. Then, to Karim's astonishment, a smile slowly formed on her face. "Well, you've wasted a lot of time, Mr. Nasir," she said with that Appalachian accent that became more pronounced when she was emotional. "True wealth isn't in banks, but in being able to sleep peacefully, knowing you've treated others as you would like to be treated." The profound simplicity of her philosophy left Karim speechless. Throughout his life, he had sought to protect himself through complex strategies, tests, and walls, when true security perhaps resided in the vulnerability of opening up to others without guarantees. "Elliot, your grandson," Karim finally said. "You mentioned he needs surgery." Winifred nodded, suddenly tense. "I'd like to help if you'll allow me," he continued. "Not as a reward for passing my tests, but as an act of, what would you call it? Humanity, Mr. Nasir," she replied with simplicity. "Simply humanity." The news that Karim Nasir would pay for little Elliot's surgery fell like lightning in Winifred's life. At first she resisted, proud as only someone who has fought their whole life to stay afloat without asking for help can be. But when Karim explained that he considered it an investment in the future, children are the only future worth securing, she finally accepted with tears in her eyes and a dignity that deeply moved the businessman. "I accept for Elliot, not for me," she had said. "But you must allow me to repay the favor somehow." "You already have," he replied. "You've returned something to me that I lost a long time ago, faith that people like you still exist." The following weeks brought surprising changes to the Nasir estate. For the first time in years, Karim cancelled several business trips and decided to remain in the Hamptons. Under the pretext of personally supervising some renovations on the property, he began to spend more and more time in spaces he previously barely set foot in. The kitchen, the garden, the small colonial patio with its central fountain, where the murmur of water created a hypnotic melody during the hot February afternoons. One morning, while Winifred was preparing clam chowder, Karim appeared in the kitchen dressed unusually casually. Cotton pants and a simple shirt, far from his usual impeccable suits. "Could you teach me?" he asked, pointing to the clams she was shelling. The surprise on Winifred's face was evident. "Teach you to make clam chowder, Mr. Nasser?" "Please, call me Karim," he replied with a smile that softened the normally serious features of his face. "After all, you already knew me by that name." She nodded, still disconcerted by the request. "I never thought a man like you would want to learn to cook something so simple." "Perhaps that has been my problem for a long time," he replied as he washed his hands in the sink, forgetting the value of simple things. For the next hour, Winifred patiently taught him how to select the perfect clams, the exact amount of garlic that should be used, not so little that you don't notice it, not so much that it scares, and the precise moment when cream should be added to emulsify correctly with the other ingredients. Karim listened with a concentration he normally reserved for multi-million-dollar negotiations, fascinated not only by the recipe, but by the way Winifred turned each step into a life lesson. "Cooking is like living," she explained as she stirred the mixture. "It needs time, patience, and knowing exactly when to stir things and when to let them rest." That cooking session became the first of many. Little by little, an unexpected routine was established at the Nasir estate. Each morning, Karim and Winifred prepared breakfast together, a fusion of Lebanese and American flavors that symbolized the cultural bridge being built between two people from seemingly irreconcilable worlds. One afternoon, while watering together the sick oak tree that Winifred had decided to save, Karim surprised himself by sharing memories of his childhood in Beirut that he hadn't unearthed in decades. The smell of cedars in the mountains, the songs his mother sang while cooking, the taste of the season's first fig picked directly from the tree. "You never talk about your family," observed Winifred, as she carefully loosened the soil around the tree. Karim remained silent for a moment, letting the water slowly filter into the thirsty earth. "I lost them during the war," he finally responded. "My father died in a bombing. My mother and my little sister from hunger during the siege of East Beirut. I survived because they had sent me with some uncles to the mountains." Winifred stopped what she was doing and, without saying a word, placed a hand on Karim's shoulder. She didn't offer empty condolences or uncomfortable questions. She was simply present, silently sharing his pain. "Sometimes I think part of me died with them," he continued, surprising himself by sharing something so intimate, "as if I had buried my ability to connect with others under layers and layers of material success." "Nothing dies completely as long as we remember it," she replied with the simple wisdom that Karim had come to value deeply. "Your parents live in you in every decision you make, in every dish you now learn to cook, in the way your eyes light up when you talk about Beirut." That night, Karim found himself contemplating the stars from his terrace, thinking about how a woman who had barely left her native province could possess such a profound understanding of life that had eluded him, with all his cosmopolitan education and international experience, for decades. "The best lessons aren't learned in universities," he thought, as he observed the moon reflecting on the Atlantic. "They're learned in the heart of those who have known how to keep their humanity intact, despite difficulties." In mid-February, the Nasir estate received an unexpected visit that would forever alter the delicate balance that had been established between Karim and Winifred. Little Elliot's operation had been a success, and the boy was recovering favorably in the private hospital in Manhattan, where Karim had insisted he receive treatment. Winifred alternated her days between working at the mansion and visits to the hospital, grateful but increasingly uncomfortable with the level of personal involvement of her employer in matters she considered strictly familial. "It's not right," she had told Karim when he offered to accompany her to the hospital. "You are very generous, but I don't want the children to get confused. We are employee and employer, not what they might imagine." Karim had respected her decision, though it hurt him more than he was willing to admit. Never before had he felt rejected for making a gesture of kindness, and the experience was new and disconcerting. That morning, an elegant black Mercedes crossed the gates of the property. From it descended a man in his 50s, impeccably dressed in a grey suit that seemed out of place under the relentless Hampton sun. "Faisal," Karim greeted coldly when his financial director entered the office unannounced. "I don't remember summoning you to the Hamptons." "You didn't, old friend," replied Faisal al-Zahrani with a calculated smile. "But when your right-hand man for 20 years discovers that you've cancelled 3 crucial meetings with investors to stay at your mansion, duty obliges me to come personally." Karim gestured for him to sit, irritated by the intrusion, but aware that Faisal wouldn't have flown from Dubai without an important reason. "And what is so urgent that it couldn't wait for my return?" Faisal opened his briefcase and extracted several documents that he carefully placed on the desk. "The acquisition offer from the Japanese chain, the Korean consortium interested in our properties in Marrakesh, and most importantly, the 3 acquisitions we had planned to expand in Southeast Asia." He paused before adding, "Opportunities that evaporate while you play at—" "What exactly, Karim, being a gardener?" The question had a cutting edge that didn't go unnoticed by Karim. It was evident that Faisal had been observing, probably talking to the mansion's staff. "My personal life is none of your business, Faisal. It is when it affects the empire we built together," he replied with sudden intensity. "Karim, I've received concerning reports about how you spend hours in the kitchen with a domestic employee, about how you paid a fortune for her grandson's surgery, about how you seemed less different." "Different?" Karim's voice acquired a dangerously low tone. "Vulnerable," specified Faisal. "And in our world, vulnerability is an invitation to disaster." At that moment, as if invoked by the conversation, Winifred gently knocked on the office door. She entered carrying a tray with coffee and traditional Lebanese sweets that she had learned to prepare specifically to please Karim. "Excuse the interruption, Mr. Nasser," she said with her usual dignity. "I thought you and your guest might like something to drink." Faisal observed her with an evaluating look that made Karim feel a wave of protective indignation. "Thank you, Winifred," he responded, trying to maintain a neutral tone. "You can leave it here." When she left, Faisal picked up one of the sweets and examined it with curiosity before tasting it. "Baklava," he murmured with surprise. "Exactly like your mother made." He looked at Karim with narrowed eyes. "I see you've entrusted her with family recipes." "I've entrusted her with more than that," replied Karim, holding his partner's gaze. "I've entrusted her with my well-being in this house." Faisal let out an incredulous laugh. "Your well-being? Karim, you haven't trusted anyone since that secretary in Dubai tried to sell confidential information to our competitors. Since Samira left you for the sheikh after swearing eternal love." Karim felt his face tense as he remembered those past betrayals. "People change," he replied with less conviction than he would have liked. "Leopards don't change their spots, old friend," retorted Faisal, leaning forward. "And neither do you. You're just going through a, let's say, phase. An existential crisis that will quickly resolve." From his briefcase, Faisal pulled out one last document and slid it across the desk. "I've found irregularities in your new protégé's personal accounts. Small transfers to a bank in Panama. Nothing spectacular, but systematic." Karim picked up the paper with hands that suddenly seemed clumsy. It was a detailed report of Winifred's financial activity over the past 5 years, something that could only have been obtained illegally. "How you investigated my employee without my authorization?" he asked, indignation growing inside him. "I protected you, as always," corrected Faisal. "This woman is no different from the others, Karim. She's just more patient, more astute. She saw an opportunity and is playing the long game." Karim stared at the document, feeling the ground moving beneath his feet. The transfers were small but regular, sent to an account not in the name of any of the family members Winifred had mentioned. For a devastating moment, all his old suspicions returned forcefully. Had he been deceived again? Was it possible that Winifred, with her apparent sincerity and kindness, was simply a more sophisticated scammer than the previous ones? "Leave me alone," he ordered Faisal, his voice barely a whisper. "Karim, we need to make decisions about these contracts today," his partner insisted. "The market doesn't wait for us to resolve personal crises." "I said leave me alone," he repeated, this time with an authority that admitted no reply. When Faisal finally withdrew, Karim remained contemplating the report, feeling how the walls he had worked so hard to tear down began to rebuild around him, brick by brick, doubt by doubt. 3 days. 3 days in which Karim shut himself in, avoiding Winifred, cancelling their shared cooking sessions with vague excuses about pending work. 3 days in which he obsessively reviewed Faisal's report, searching for alternative explanations that might justify those suspicious transfers. Winifred had noticed the change immediately. On the first morning when he didn't appear in the kitchen, she waited patiently, assuming he had overslept or was busy with some important call. On the second morning, when he sent her a message through Prudence saying he would have breakfast in his office, she began to worry. By the third day, when he barely greeted her as they crossed in the hallway, the worry had transformed into a painful certainty. Something had fundamentally changed between them. That afternoon, while Karim worked in his office, Winifred gently knocked on the door. "Come in," he replied, quickly hiding the report under other documents. "Excuse the interruption, Mr. Nasser," she said, and Karim immediately noticed she had reverted to addressing him formally. "I just wanted to know if there's something bothering you, if I've done something wrong." Her direct honesty, the same quality he had so valued in her, now seemed like a double-edged sword to him. Was it genuine, or part of an elaborate act? "You haven't done anything wrong, Winifred," he replied with calculated coldness. "I'm simply busy with important company matters." She nodded, but didn't move from her place. Her eyes, normally warm and expressive, now reflected a contained sadness that made something twist in Karim's chest. "I understand," she finally said. "But I was wondering—" "Yes?" he encouraged when she hesitated. "I was wondering if you would like to accompany me to the hospital tomorrow. Elliot will be discharged, and he has been asking about you. It seems he was very impressed when you visited that time." The mention of little Elliot was like a stab for Karim. During his brief visit to the hospital, the boy had looked at him with enormous eyes, full of admiration, asking if it was true he had hotels in countries whose names he couldn't even pronounce. The innocence of his curiosity had touched something deep in Karim. "I don't believe that would be appropriate," he responded, hating each word as it left his mouth. "Of course," she replied immediately, with a dignity that made Karim feel even worse. "It was a silly suggestion. You are a busy man." She turned to leave, but before reaching the door, Karim couldn't contain himself. "Winifred," he called, "is there something you need to tell me? Something about your personal affairs?" She looked at him with genuine bewilderment. "I don't understand the question, sir." "Money," he specified, increasingly uncomfortable but unable to stop himself. "Transfers to accounts abroad, that kind of personal affairs." Winifred's face lost color so evidently that Karim almost rose to support her, fearing she might faint. Instead, she leaned against the doorframe, breathed deeply several times, and then looked at him with an expression he couldn't interpret. "I see," she finally said, with a voice that seemed to come from very far away. "You've been investigating me." It wasn't a question, but a painful observation. "It's standard procedure," he defended himself. Although he knew it was a lie, he had never before investigated a domestic employee so thoroughly. "Security is important in a property like this." Winifred nodded slowly, as if processing not just his words, but everything they implied about the relationship they believed they had built. "You're right," she finally responded. "Security is important. And you have the right to know who you're dealing with." She paused before adding, "But you could have asked me directly, Karim. I thought we had moved past the stage of masks and disguises." The disappointment in her voice was palpable, and Karim felt as if something precious was breaking before his eyes without him being able to do anything to prevent it. "The transfers," he insisted, clinging to the only concrete thing amid that emotional whirlwind. "Can you explain them?" "I can," she replied with a calmness that contrasted with her paleness. "But I won't. Not under these circumstances." The response left Karim momentarily speechless. It wasn't the reaction of someone caught in a lie, nor the indignation he would expect from someone falsely accused. "What do you mean?" he finally asked. "I mean that when you're ready to truly trust, to ask from respect and not suspicion, I'll be willing to talk. Until then," she breathed deeply before continuing, "until then, I believe it's better we go back to being simply employer and employee." Without waiting for a response, Winifred left the office, gently closing the door behind her. Karim remained paralyzed, feeling he had just committed a colossal mistake but not knowing how to remedy it. For weeks, he had worked to tear down his own walls of distrust, only to rebuild them in a matter of days at the first shadow of doubt. That night, alone in his room, he contemplated the garden illuminated by the moon. The sick oak that Winifred had saved with such dedication already showed small green shoots, signs of a recovery that seemed like a miracle after all the professional gardeners had given it up for lost. "Perhaps," thought Karim as he observed the branches swaying gently in the night breeze, "perhaps it's I who needs to be saved now." The following week passed in a painful formality. Winifred fulfilled her obligations with the same efficiency as always, but the warmth that had characterized her manner had disappeared, replaced by a professional courtesy that made the Nasser estate feel once again like the emotional mausoleum it had always been. Karim, for his part, immersed himself in work, finally accepting the business proposals that Faisal had brought, coordinating video conferences at untimely hours with partners in Asia and the Middle East. But his mind constantly returned to Winifred's expression when he mentioned the transfers. It wasn't guilt he had seen in her eyes. It was something much more complex, a mixture of pain and resignation that didn't fit with someone who had been discovered in a fraud. One evening, while reviewing some contracts on the terrace, he spotted Winifred in the garden. She was crouched beside a rose bush, carefully pruning the dry branches. The setting sun bathed the scene with a golden light that seemed straight out of a Renaissance painting, illuminating her figure with an almost mystical glow. Without thinking twice, Karim left the documents on the table and went down to the garden. He approached slowly, allowing her to notice his presence before speaking. "Roses need space to breathe," he commented, remembering the gardening lessons his mother gave him on the small terrace of their home in Beirut. "Pruning dead branches isn't cruelty, it's compassion." Winifred didn't raise her gaze from her task, but nodded slightly. "My grandmother said that plants are wiser than people," she responded after a moment. "They know how to let go of what no longer serves them to make room for the new." The silence that followed was charged with unexpressed meanings, with words stuck in the throats of both. "Winifred," Karim finally began, "about our conversation the other day." "It's not necessary, Mr. Nasser," she interrupted, using the formal treatment again that now sounded like an insurmountable barrier between them. "I perfectly understand your position." "No, you don't," he insisted, crouching to be at her level, "because even I didn't understand it until recently." She put down the pruning shears on the ground and finally looked him in the eyes. "And now you do?" "Now I know I acted out of fear," he confessed. "Fear of trusting again, of being hurt again. It's easier to suspect everyone than to risk believing and being wrong." "Fear is a bad counselor," she replied, her voice softening slightly. "It makes you see enemies where there are only people trying to survive as best they can." Karim breathed deeply, preparing himself for what he was about to do, an act of faith that went against all his instincts forged during decades of distrust. "I don't need to know about the transfers," he declared. "I don't need explanations or proofs. What you do with your money is your business, not mine." Winifred looked at him for a long time, evaluating the sincerity of his words. "Why this change?" she finally asked. "Because I realized I was about to destroy the only genuine thing I've found in years, because of old ghosts," he responded with honesty. "And because, regardless of any explanation, what you've brought to my life can't be measured or judged with financial reports." Something seemed to break inside Winifred. Her eyes filled with tears that she obstinately refused to shed. "The transfers," she finally said with a trembling voice, "are for my brother Maxwell. He's lived in Panama for 20 years. He has multiple sclerosis, and the healthcare system there isn't like here. I send what I can each month, but it's never enough." Karim felt the air leave his lungs. Of all the possible explanations, he had never considered one so simple and painful. "Why didn't you tell me when I asked?" he inquired gently. "Because you didn't ask," she replied with simplicity. "You accused, and throughout my life I've learned that explanations offered under accusation are rarely heard." The truth of her words hit Karim forcefully. Indeed, he hadn't asked seeking to understand, but seeking to confirm his suspicions. "I'm sorry," he said, words he didn't remember having pronounced in decades. "I'm deeply sorry, Winifred." She nodded, accepting his apology with the same dignity with which she faced everything in life. "We all make mistakes, Karim," she responded, naturally returning to calling him by name. "The difference lies in those who are capable of recognizing them." For several minutes they remained in silence. The only sound was the murmur of the wind among the trees and the distant rumble of the sea. Finally, Winifred took up her pruning shears again and continued with her task. "The most beautiful roses are those that have survived the most severe prunings," she commented, as if sharing an ancestral secret. "Just like people." Karim observed her hands working delicately among the thorns, hands that had known hard work all their life, but that retained an amazing gentleness when dealing with living beings. "Winifred," he said suddenly, "I want to help your brother." She stopped her work and looked at him with surprise. "It's not necessary," she began to protest. "You've already done enough with Elliot, and—" "I'm not doing it out of obligation or to compensate for my error," he interrupted. "I'm doing it because I can, because I have resources that could make a real difference in his life, and not using them would be a form of avarice that I no longer want to practice." Winifred looked at him for a long time, as if evaluating something much deeper than his words. "All right," she finally conceded, "but with one condition." "Which?" he asked, surprised by the sudden firmness in her voice. "That you come with me tomorrow to meet my grandchildren. Elliot hasn't stopped asking about you since you visited him in the hospital. He says he wants to show you his collection of miniature cars." A genuine smile, the first in many days, illuminated Karim's face. "It's a deal," he replied, extending his hand to seal the agreement. When their hands met, both felt that something fundamental had changed between them. It wasn't a return to the point where they had left off, but a new beginning, this time built on more solid foundations. The mutual recognition of the vulnerability and strength that dwells in every human being. Winifred's modest apartment in the Bridgehampton neighborhood, on the outskirts of the Hamptons, dramatically contrasted with the opulence of the Nasser estate. A third-floor walk-up in a building from the 70s, with thin walls and noisy neighbors. However, when Karim crossed the threshold that afternoon, he felt a warmth he had rarely experienced in his luxury properties scattered around the world. The space was small but immaculate, decorated with an eclectic mix of inherited furniture, family photographs, and small treasures accumulated during a lifetime. Each corner told a story. Each object seemed to have a purpose and meaning that transcended its material value. "It's him! It's the hotel man!" exclaimed a little voice from the hallway, before a small boy appeared running with a visible recent scar on his chest, visible under his superhero t-shirt. Elliot stopped a meter from Karim, suddenly shy before the presence of the man who had paid for his surgery. His older brothers, Montgomery at 12 and Thaddeus at 10, appeared behind, observing the visitor with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Boys, greet Mr. Nasser," instructed Winifred, trying to impose some formality on the meeting. "Please call me Karim," he insisted, crouching to be at Elliot's level. "I've heard you have an impressive collection of miniature cars." The little boy's eyes immediately lit up. "I have 27, and Grandma promised me a new one when I turn 7. "When will that be?" asked Karim with genuine interest. "In 2 weeks and 3 days, replied the boy with mathematical precision. What followed was an afternoon that Karim would forever keep in his memory as one of the most authentically happy moments of his adult life. Elliot proudly showed him his collection, explaining with encyclopedic detail the characteristics of each model. Montgomery, initially reserved, became animated when he discovered that his guest had visited countries he only knew from geography books. Thaddeus, the most artistic of the three, showed him his drawings, mostly imaginary landscapes where a bright sun and a house with a tree always appeared. "It's our house in West Virginia," explained the boy, "the one we had before Mom's accident." Karim observed the drawing with attention. Despite the simplicity of the childish strokes, there was something touching in the way Thaddeus had represented that lost home, not as a physical structure, but as a symbol of security and belonging. "It's a beautiful drawing," he commented. "You have a gift for capturing what's important." Winifred had prepared a simple snack, hot chocolate and homemade cookies that filled the small apartment with a comforting aroma. While the children ate, she and Karim conversed in low voices about plans for the treatment of Winifred's brother in Panama. "I know specialists in the United States," explained Karim. "We could arrange a telemedicine consultation initially and then assess if a transfer for in-person treatment is necessary." Winifred looked at him with an indecipherable expression as he elaborated plans and strategies to help a man he didn't even know. It was as if she were seeing a completely new aspect of her employer, a facet that totally contradicted the image of the cold and calculating man that everyone described. "Why do you do all this?" she finally asked during a moment when the children had retreated to their room. "And don't tell me because you can. There are millions of needy people in the world, and you can't help them all." Karim considered the question for a long moment, searching within himself for the truth that even he hadn't fully understood. "Perhaps," he began slowly, "because for too long I've used my wealth as a barrier between the world and myself, as a fortress to keep everyone at a distance, and now I'm discovering that it can also be a bridge." He paused before continuing. "Or perhaps it's simpler than that. Perhaps it's because for the first time in decades, I feel part of something I can't buy. A genuine human connection." Winifred observed him for a long time, as if seeing beyond the surface to the very core of his being. "Do you know the difference between charity and solidarity, Karim?" she finally asked. "Enlighten me," he replied, intrigued by the direction the conversation was taking. "Charity keeps hierarchies intact. The giver remains above, the receiver remains below. Solidarity, on the other hand, recognizes that we are all vulnerable, that we all need help at different moments in our lives." Her words resonated deeply with Karim, who had never considered his philanthropic acts from that perspective. "Are you suggesting that my help is a form of maintaining control?" he asked, not defensively, but with genuine curiosity. "I'm suggesting," she replied softly, "that the real gift isn't the money you offer, but the humanity you're rediscovering in doing so." Before he could respond, Elliot reappeared in the living room, carefully holding something in his small hands. "Mr. Karim," he said with childish solemnity, "I want you to have this." He extended his hands to reveal a small toy car, a red Ferrari that was clearly one of his most prized possessions. "But Elliot," intervened Winifred, "it's your favorite." "That's why," replied the boy with crushing logic, "because it's special, like what he did for me." Karim felt a knot in his throat as he accepted the gift, understanding the enormous significance of the gesture. It wasn't simply a toy. It was the most valuable offering the child could make, an act of pure generosity that far surpassed any bank transfer he had made. "It's the most beautiful present I've received in my life," he said with a voice hoarse with emotion. "I'll keep it always." That night, back at the Nasir estate, Karim contemplated the small red Ferrari he had placed on his desk, an object without material value but of incalculable emotional worth. For the first time in his adult life, he allowed himself to cry openly, not from sadness but from a mixture of gratitude and amazement at the generosity of a spirit that had not been corrupted by the complexities and calculations of the adult world. He understood then, with a clarity that left him breathless, that it wasn't he who had been helping Winifred and her family. It was they who, without knowing it, were saving him from the invisible prison he himself had built, with bars of distrust and walls of solitude. April arrived on the Hampton shore with a characteristic gentleness, tempering the heat of summer without the autumnal melancholy of other latitudes. At the Nasir estate, the changes went far beyond the seasonal. What began as small modifications in Karim's routine, breakfast in the kitchen instead of his office, evening walks through the garden, impromptu conversations with the maintenance staff, soon transformed into a complete reorganization of his priorities. To the astonishment of Faisal and the rest of his management team, Karim began to delegate responsibilities that he previously considered non-transferable. He reduced his international travel to the bare minimum and established a strict limit for work calls after 7 in the evening. But the most disconcerting for those who had known him for years was his new interest in aspects of the business that he had always ignored. The well-being of employees in his hotels, sustainability policies, integration programs with local communities. "It's as if he's been abducted by aliens and replaced by an imposter with social conscience," Faisal ironically commented during a video conference with other directors. "Soon, he'll tell us he wants to transform the Four Palms in Abu Dhabi into a shelter for refugees." What Faisal didn't know was that Karim wasn't just reassessing his business approach, but also exploring possibilities that he would never have considered 6 months before. One afternoon, after another visit to Winifred's modest apartment, where he had helped Montgomery with his math homework, Karim made a decision that would change the course of many lives. "I want to create a foundation," he announced to Winifred as they returned in his car to the Nasir estate. "An organization that provides comprehensive support to domestic workers in vulnerable situations. Training, legal advice, medical care, scholarships for their children." Winifred looked at him with a mixture of surprise and caution, aware that grand declarations don't always translate into concrete actions. "It's a beautiful idea," she responded diplomatically, "but it requires much more than money. It requires truly understanding the needs of people whose lives are very different from yours." "That's why I want you to run it," he replied, keeping his eyes on the road, but noticing from the corner of his eye how she straightened in her seat, visibly impacted by the proposal. "Me? Karim, I don't have the training to run a foundation. I barely finished high school." "You have something much more valuable than any university degree," he insisted. "First-hand knowledge of what it means to struggle each day to maintain dignity in adverse circumstances. Real empathy, not theoretical, and a natural intelligence that continues to amaze me every day." The silence that followed was charged with complex emotions. Finally, Winifred spoke in a low voice. "Are you sure this isn't just exaggerated gratitude? Or some kind of compensation for having distrusted me?" The question was direct and penetrating, something that Karim had come to deeply appreciate about her, her ability to question his motives without being disrespectful. "At the beginning, perhaps there was something of that," he admitted honestly. "But now it's much more. It's recognition of your value, of what you could contribute. And it's also an act of faith that we can transform painful experiences into something constructive." Winifred looked out the window, observing how the coastal landscape of the Hamptons slid before her eyes. Her life had taken so many unexpected turns in recent months that sometimes she felt she was living in a dream from which she would soon awaken. "I would need help," she finally said. "A lot of help." "You'll have it," Karim assured, feeling a wave of relief and joy course through him as he understood she was seriously considering his proposal. "But you would set the direction, the values, The priorities. I would just provide the resources. And I would have to continue caring for my grandchildren. They are and will always be my priority. Of course. In fact, Karim paused, aware that what he was about to suggest could be perceived as excessive intrusion. I've been thinking about that too. The guest house on the Nasir estate is completely underutilized. It has 3 bedrooms, its own garden, independent entrance. You and the children could move in there. You would have more space. The little ones could use the pool, and you would be close to your work both in the main house and at the foundation. Winifred was momentarily speechless, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Karim was offering. Not just a professional change, but a complete transformation of the environment and possibilities for her family. It's too much, she finally murmured. All this. Why me? Karim stopped the car at a viewpoint overlooking the Atlantic, a place where the horizon seemed infinite and the turquoise waters merged with the sky in a promise of limitless possibilities. Do you remember the sick oak that you were determined to save when everyone else had given up on it? He asked, turning to look at her directly. She nodded, disconcerted by the apparent change of topic. Yesterday it gave its first leaves, he continued. Small, fragile, but there they were. A miracle that only happened because someone believed it was possible. He paused before continuing. For a long time, Winifred, I was like that tree, apparently successful on the outside, but hollow and withered inside. And you, without intending to, showed me that I can still flourish, that it's not too late to find a purpose that transcends the mere accumulation of wealth. The words floated between them, sincere and vulnerable, creating a moment of connection that went beyond employer and employee, beyond even conventional friendship. All right, Winifred finally said, with a smile that illuminated her entire face. I accept, but with one more condition. Name it, he replied, prepared for any reasonable demand, that the foundation also looks after elderly adults who are alone, like my brother, and that one of its programs is specifically dedicated to connecting children without grandparents with elders without grandchildren. Because loneliness, Karim, is the true poverty of our time. He extended his hand to shake hers, sealing a pact that went far beyond the professional. It's a deal, he affirmed with conviction, and I think we've just planted the seed of something that will flourish when we're no longer here to see it. The sun was beginning to set over the Atlantic, tinting the sky in reddish and golden hues that seemed to silently celebrate the birth of a shared vision. The news that Karim Nasser, known for his relentless focus on financial results, was redirecting a considerable portion of his resources toward a social foundation, fell like a bomb in business circles of the Middle East and the United States. What provoked genuine bewilderment, however, was the announcement that said foundation would be directed by a woman without academic training, who until recently worked as a domestic employee in one of his properties. Faisal was the first to present himself at the Nasir estate, just 3 days after the official announcement. You've completely lost your mind, he declared, without preamble upon entering Karim's office. The board is up in arms. Shareholders are demanding explanations. Do you have any idea of the damage you're causing to the group's reputation? Karim observed him calmly from the other side of his desk, where the small red Ferrari that Elliot had gifted him now occupied a prominent place. Good morning to you too, Faisal, he responded with studied tranquility. Coffee? Winifred prepared baklava this morning. I don't want coffee or sweets. I want you to explain what the hell you're doing, exploded his partner, losing the composure that characterized him. First, you donate $5 million to a children's hospital in New York. Then you announce you'll reduce your involvement in daily operations. And now this, a foundation run by your maid. Winifred Caldwell is not my maid, Karim corrected, with a tone that admitted no reply. She is the executive director of the New Dawn Foundation and one of the wisest people I've ever met. Faisal looked at him as if he were contemplating a stranger. Are you listening to yourself? You sound like one of those self-help gurus you so despised. He collapsed into a chair, suddenly exhausted. What has this woman done to you, Karim? What kind of influence does she exert over you? The question, formulated with genuine concern, made Karim reflect. How to explain the internal transformation he had experienced. How to describe the process of rediscovering himself through the eyes of someone who saw value beyond his wealth. It's not what she's done to me, he finally responded. It's what she's allowed me to see for myself, that I've been measuring success with the wrong parameters all my life. Faisal rubbed his face with his hands, visibly frustrated. Look, I understand that you've had some sort of existential crisis. It happens, especially at our age, but there are more conventional ways to address it. Buy a bigger yacht, adopt an extravagant hobby, marry a model 30 years younger. Don't put at risk the work of your entire life. I'm not putting anything at risk, Karim replied firmly. The foundation represents less than 5% of my personal assets. The hotel group continues to function exactly the same, just now with more delegation and better labor policies. It's the beginning of a dangerous path, insisted Faisal. Today it's 5%, tomorrow it will be 10%, and before you realize it, you'll be giving away the empire we built with so much effort. Karim observed his old friend with a mixture of understanding and distance. He saw in him the man he himself had been not long ago, obsessed with accumulation, unable to conceive of success in terms that weren't purely material. Faisal, he said softly, do you remember the night we spent trapped in that sandstorm in Wadi Rum when we were negotiating the purchase of the resort in Aqaba? His partner's face momentarily softened at the memory. Of course. We thought we wouldn't survive. And do you remember what you said when the storm finally subsided and we saw the stars appear brighter than ever? Faisal remained silent, evidently uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. You said that if we survived, you wanted to dedicate more time to your family, continued Karim. That your biggest regret was having been absent during your children's childhood to pursue business. That all the money in the world wasn't worth the price of those lost moments. It was an extreme situation, Faisal defended himself. People say many things when they believe they're going to die. Or perhaps it's the only moment when we speak the truth, countered Karim. The truth that we normally bury under layers of rationalization and compromise. A tense silence settled between the two men who had shared so much over decades. Finally, Faisal spoke with a more contained voice. Not all of us have the luxury of reinventing ourselves, Karim. Some of us have responsibilities, expectations to fulfill. Or perhaps they're chains we've imposed on ourselves, responded Karim. No one on their deathbed regrets not having worked more hours or accumulated more wealth. At that moment, a soft knock on the door interrupted the conversation. Winifred entered with a tray of coffee and traditional sweets, apparently oblivious to the tension that permeated the room. I thought you might like something to accompany your conversation, she said naturally. Business is always better discussed with a satisfied stomach, as my father used to say. Faisal observed her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, evaluating the woman who had apparently transformed his old friend and partner so profoundly. So you are Winifred Caldwell, he finally said, the new executive director. And you must be Faisal al-Zahrani, she replied with an affable smile as she served the coffee. Karim speaks very highly of you. He says that without your financial vision, the group would never have achieved its current position. The compliment, as unexpected as it was apparently sincere, took Faisal by surprise. He had expected to find a calculating opportunist, not this woman of simple manners and transparent gaze. The foundation will need solid financial advice, continued Winifred as she handed him a cup of coffee. Karim suggested that perhaps you could recommend someone you trust to manage the accounting and tax aspects. If it's not too much trouble, of course. The strategy was as elegant as it was effective. Instead of antagonizing or defending herself, Winifred was extending a bridge, inviting Faisal to be part of the new initiative, recognizing his experience and his position as Karim's indispensable ally. Faisal took a sip of coffee, visibly disconcerted by the turn of events. This coffee is prepared exactly as in Beirut, he commented, clearly surprised. Karim taught me, explained Winifred. He says his mother prepared it this way, and that it was what he missed most during his first years in Dubai. Something imperceptibly changed in Faisal's expression. For an instant, the hard businessman gave way to someone more vulnerable, someone capable of recognizing a genuine human connection. I could recommend Samira Khoury to you, he finally said. She was my first assistant when we started in Dubai. Now she runs her own financial consultancy. She's absolutely incorruptible and has specific experience with foundations. That would be perfect, responded Winifred with evident satisfaction. Thank you, Mr. Al-Zahrani. When Winifred left the office, Faisal remained staring fixedly at Karim. "Now I understand," he finally said. "What do you understand? Why her influence on you is working. It's not manipulation or seduction in the conventional sense. It's something much more powerful. Authenticity." Karim smiled, satisfied that his friend was beginning to glimpse what he had discovered over the past months. "So, do I have your support?" he finally asked. Faisal sighed deeply before responding. "Conditional," he specified. "I'll continue to watch that you don't throw away everything we've built, but—" he made a significant pause. "I recognize that perhaps the time has come to balance the scales. To remember why we started all this in the first place. When Faisal left that afternoon, something fundamental had changed. It wasn't a surrender or a complete conversion to Karim's new vision, but the beginning of a more authentic dialogue, the possibility of a shared path that integrated the best of both perspectives. The day of the official inauguration of the New Dawn Foundation dawned with a clear sky and a gentle breeze that made the flags installed in front of the building that would house its headquarters wave. An old manor house in the historic center of East Hampton, restored respecting its original architecture, but adapted for its new purpose with modern and accessible facilities. Karim observed the preparations from the window of his office on the second floor. They had been intense months of planning, permits, hiring, and above all, deep reflection on the purpose and values that would guide this new stage of his life. "You're nervous," commented Winifred upon entering, carrying a folder with the documents for his inaugural speech. It wasn't a question, but an observation. "It's strange," he admitted, unconsciously adjusting his tie in front of the mirror. "I've presented billion-dollar projects before sheikhs and prime ministers without feeling a trace of anxiety. And today, before a group of social workers and potential beneficiaries of the foundation. Because this is personal," she completed, approaching to slightly straighten his tie in a gesture that had acquired a surprising naturalness between them. "You're not selling hotel rooms or maximizing investment returns. You're offering a part of yourself, your vision for a better world." Karim looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. In recent months, Winifred had evolved in a way that no one, not even herself, could have predicted. She remained the simple and direct woman he had met, but she had developed a confidence and natural authority that commanded respect without the need for poses or artifices. "Are the children ready?" he asked, referring to her grandchildren, who would have a special role in the ceremony. "More than ready. Elliot has rehearsed his part so much that I think he could recite it in his sleep," she replied with evident pride. "Although he's a little disappointed that you won't be able to sit with them during the event." "I'll make it up later," promised Karim. "Perhaps we could take them to that pizzeria they like so much in the center." The exchange was interrupted by the arrival of Prudence, now Winifred's executive assistant, announcing that the first guests had begun to arrive and that the media were setting up their equipment in the designated area. "It's time," said Karim, breathing deeply. "Are you ready?" "No," replied Winifred with honesty. "But I suppose no one really is when they embark on something that can change many lives, including their own." They descended together the stairs to the colonial patio that would be the central scenario of the inauguration. There, under a tent that protected from the sun but allowed natural light to bathe the space, chairs had been arranged for about 200 guests. In the front row, Thaddeus, Montgomery, and Elliot waited impatiently, dressed in their best clothes, attentively watched over by Prudence. Among the attendees, Karim distinguished familiar faces and new ones. Faisal, who had finally accepted to be part of the foundation's board, Samira Khoury, the brilliant financier who had developed a sustainable economic plan, representatives of local social organizations, municipal authorities, and most importantly, some of the people who would be the first beneficiaries of the programs: domestic workers, caregivers of the elderly, single mothers, undocumented immigrants. The ceremony began with the intervention of a representative from the City Hall, followed by Faisal's words, surprisingly emotional for someone usually so pragmatic. Then came the moment awaited by all, the official presentation of the executive director, Winifred Caldwell. Upon ascending to the small stage, Winifred experienced a second of panic. She, who had never spoken in public beyond parent meetings at her grandchildren's school, was about to address an audience that included powerful business people and journalists eager for an impactful story. But a glance at her grandchildren, seated in the front row with expressions of absolute pride, was enough for her to find the necessary calm. She wasn't there representing just herself, but all the people like her, who had struggled silently day after day to maintain dignity in adverse circumstances. "I'm not an expert in elegant speeches," she began with simplicity. "I come from a world where words matter less than actions, where character is measured by the ability to rise each time life knocks you down." As she spoke, her voice gained firmness and conviction. She explained the Foundation's mission not from theory or statistics, but from lived experience. The difficulties of workers invisible to society, the loneliness of abandoned elderly, the obstacles faced by children from vulnerable families to access educational opportunities. "This foundation is born from an unlikely story," she continued. "The story of an encounter between two people who should never have crossed paths according to the conventional rules of the world." She looked directly at Karim, who observed her from one side of the stage. "A man who had everything materially, but had lost faith in humanity, and a woman who barely had enough to subsist but never lost the certainty that kindness sooner or later finds its way." A murmur ran through the audience. The story of how the powerful Karim Nasir had met his domestic employee and how this relationship had transformed both was known in intimate circles, but had never been expressed so openly in public. "What the New Dawn Foundation proposes is not charity," emphasized Winifred. "It's recognition. Recognition of the inherent dignity in each human being, regardless of their social position, origin, or education. Recognition that we all have something valuable to contribute and that we all at some point in our lives need support." When she concluded her speech, a reverent silence preceded applause that began timidly but grew into an ovation. Karim was the first to stand, quickly followed by Faisal and the rest of the attendees. The children applauded with overflowing enthusiasm, Elliot whistling with 2 fingers as a classmate had taught him. Then came the culminating moment of the ceremony. Elliot, Montgomery, and Thaddeus went up to the stage, carrying a large golden scissors that they could barely hold between the 3. Karim and Winifred stood beside them in front of a ribbon that crossed the main entrance of the building. "On the count of 3, indicated Karim, guiding the children's hands. 1, 2, 3. The ribbon fell amid applause and cheers, symbolizing not just the official opening of the foundation, but also the beginning of a new stage in the life of all involved. As attendees began to enter the building for the guided tour, Karim approached Winifred, who had remained momentarily alone in a corner of the patio, visibly moved, but trying to compose herself. "You were extraordinarily good," he complimented her sincerely. "I couldn't have chosen a better director. I still find it hard to believe that all this is real," she confessed, contemplating the building that would house dreams and projects that until recently seemed impossible. "Sometimes I think I'll wake up in my small apartment, and it will all have been a dream too good to be true." "It's as real as we are," he replied, discreetly taking her hand. "As real as the path we've decided to walk together, whatever form it takes." The look they exchanged contained a silent promise, a confirmation that what had been born between them, that connection that transcended conventional categories, would continue to evolve and surprise them. At that precise instant, Elliot appeared running, breaking the intimate moment, but bringing the contagious joy that characterized him. "Grandma, Mr. Karim, come quick. They're serving chocolate cakes and Faisal said I can eat as many as I want." Laughing, both followed the boy to the interior of the building, where the future they had imagined together was beginning to take shape, not as an ethereal dream, but as a tangible reality built with determination, courage, and the certainty that it's never too late to be reborn. A year after the inauguration of the New Dawn Foundation, life at the Nasir estate had found a new rhythm, as different from the previous one as a symphony can be from a military march. What was once a silent and opulent property, inhabited more by ghosts of the past than by living presences, now pulsated with renewed energy. The guest house, originally offered as a temporary residence for Winifred and her grandchildren, had become their permanent home. The children had flourished in this privileged environment, Thaddeus discovering a passion for swimming that had led him to compete at the regional level, Montgomery developing his artistic talent under the tutelage of a local painter whom Karim had hired as a private teacher, and little Elliot, completely recovered from his surgery, transformed into a whirlwind of energy that filled the property with laughter and mischief. The foundation, in turn, had exceeded all expectations. In just 12 months, It had implemented programs that directly benefited more than 500 families in vulnerable situations, had established a professional training center for domestic workers, and had initiated an innovative intergenerational project that connected children without grandparents with elders, without grandchildren, creating chosen families that enriched the lives of all involved. It was a particularly beautiful September afternoon when Karim organized a small celebration in the mansion's garden. It wasn't a formal event or related to the foundation, but something much more intimate. Exactly 1 year had passed since the sick oak that Winifred had been determined to save gave its first harvest of acorns. In the center of the English garden, they had set a table under the shade of the now exuberant oak. White linen tablecloths, informal but elegant tableware, and in the center a pitcher of lemonade prepared with the first lemons of the season, grown in the garden that Winifred and the children had created in a sunny corner of the property. The guests were few but significant. Faisal and his wife Amina, who after years of distant marriage had rediscovered their connection, thanks in part to the changes they observed in Karim. Samira Khoury, the brilliant financier who managed the economic aspects of the foundation and had become Thaddeus's mentor, and Maxwell, Winifred's brother, transferred from Panama thanks to an experimental treatment for his multiple sclerosis that showed promising results. "I propose a toast," announced Karim when everyone was seated around the table, raising his glass of lemonade. "To sick trees that recover, to people who don't lose faith, and to the everyday miracles that we often overlook." "To everyday miracles," chorused everyone, as the last rays of the summer sun filtered through the oak's leaves, creating a kaleidoscopic effect on the white tablecloth. After the meal, while the adults conversed and the children played in the garden, Karim and Winifred discreetly moved away, walking to a small labyrinth of hedges they had designed together in the previous months. "Do you know what day it is today, besides the anniversary of the first harvest?" he asked when they reached the center of the labyrinth, where a marble fountain murmured its eternal song. "Of course," she replied with a smile. "It's exactly 1 year and 3 months since you appeared at the back door of the kitchen, asking for water with a beggar's voice." He laughed, still surprised by the precision with which she remembered dates and details. "I never imagined that on that day I was making the most important decision of my life," he confessed, taking her hands in his. "I believed I was testing your honesty, when in reality I was taking the first step toward my own redemption. Life has a peculiar sense of humor," she observed, "and a wisdom that goes far beyond our plans." Karim nodded, suddenly serious. "Winifred, there's something I want to ask you, something I've been considering for months." She looked at him with curiosity, perceiving the unusual intensity in his tone. "I'm listening," she simply responded. "These months together have shown me a way of living that I never thought possible," he began, carefully choosing his words. "We've built something beautiful, the foundation, the home we share with the children, this new version of myself that still surprises me each morning when I look in the mirror." He paused, visibly nervous, something very rare in a man accustomed to negotiating millions with absolute composure. "What I want to ask is, if you would consider formalizing our relationship." Winifred looked at him with a mixture of surprise and caution. "Are you referring to marriage?" she asked directly, true to her nature. "Not necessarily," he quickly clarified. "I know we both come from very different experiences and cultures, that you have your independence, your role as director of the foundation. I don't want to complicate that with traditional expectations or social pressures." He took a breath before continuing. "What I'm proposing is a mutual commitment, defined by ourselves, not by conventions. A pact to continue this journey together, supporting each other mutually, creating a home for these children who have become a fundamental part of my life, and for any other person who needs refuge in the future." Winifred remained silent for a moment, processing his words with the same seriousness with which she took all important decisions. "I'm afraid I'll have to decline your offer, Karim," she finally said. His face immediately reflected his disappointment, though he tried to hide it with dignity. "Of course, I completely understand. It was hasty of me, and—" "You didn't let me finish," she interrupted him firmly. "I'll have to decline your offer of an indefinite commitment, because at my age, I no longer have time for ambiguities. If we're going to do this, let's do it completely." A smile began to form on Karim's lips as he understood what she was saying. "Are you proposing—" "I'm proposing marriage, yes," confirmed Winifred, with her characteristic frankness. At our age, with our experiences, and after all we've lived through together, I think we can allow ourselves that leap of faith. Karim's joyful laughter resonated in the small clearing of the labyrinth, momentarily startling a pair of robins resting on the edge of the fountain. Winifred Caldwell, you've just made me the happiest man on the Atlantic, he declared, embracing her with a spontaneity that would have been unthinkable for the Karim of a year ago. Are you sure you'll be able to bear a reformed old grouch like me? I've spent my whole life dealing with difficult personalities, she replied with humor. And besides, you're not so grouchy anymore. The children have considerably softened you. The sound of children's laughter reached them, as if the universe were confirming her words. In the distance, they could see Elliot chasing butterflies while Montgomery drew sitting under an apple tree, and Thaddeus explained something to Maxwell with enthusiastic gestures. They are the real miracle, commented Karim, observing the scene with moist eyes. They've taught me more about life in 1 year than all my financial gurus in decades. Winifred rested her head on Karim's shoulder, contemplating the garden that was now the epicenter of their shared universe. The oak she had saved, the children who flourished under their joint care, the foundation that extended this same philosophy of care and second chances to hundreds of people. Do you know what's most beautiful about all this? She reflected. What? He asked, encircling her waist with a protective arm. That we were all saved. You believed you were rescuing me and the children from a life of difficulties. I thought I was helping you recover your lost humanity. But the truth is that each found exactly what they needed in the other, like pieces of a puzzle that finally fit together. Karim meditated on her words, recognizing the profound truth they contained. My mother used to say that the true purpose of life is not to accumulate successes but to cultivate connections, he recalled. It took me half a century to understand what she meant. At that moment, Elliot appeared running along the path of the labyrinth, his cheeks flushed with excitement. Grandma! Mr. Karim, come quick. The cake is ready, and Faisal says if we don't come back soon, he and Montgomery will eat it all. We'd better hurry, laughed Winifred. Never underestimate the appetite of an 8-year-old boy, or an international banker. As they returned to the table under the oak, hand in hand and following Elliot's hurried steps, Karim had the absolute certainty that after a lifetime of pursuing success in the wrong places, he had finally found the true meaning of wealth, not in bank accounts or global properties, but in the ability to create a space where others could flourish. And perhaps that, he thought as he watched Winifred laugh at something Maxwell said, was the most valuable legacy any human being could aspire to leave, a garden of second chances where what seemed irremediably lost, whether a sick oak, a boy with a fragile heart or a man hardened by distrust, could find the way back to the light.